The wind in Bitter Ridge had teeth, and it bit down hard. It howled through the sagebrush, whispering secrets of every broken man and every forgotten promise this dust-choked land had ever swallowed. Dawn was just a crack of blood on the horizon, and the air carried a smell colder than iron, colder than the grave. It was the smell of a choice about to be made. She was kneeling in the dirt. Her dress, once white, was now a map of shame and dried blood. Her wrists were raw, rubbed clean of skin by a rough rope, but she wasn't crying. Her eyes, bloodshot and fierce, were locked on the man who stood over her. His silhouette was a giant black cutout against the rising sun, and in his hand a long knife glinted. It wasn't a fancy blade. It was a working knife, made for skinning things and for silence. This was Jedediah Crow, a man they called an Apache ghost, a man too red for the white folks and too white for his own. He was a walking storm, and he stood over her like a tree planted in grief. The girl licked her cracked lips. Her voice was barely a whisper, a sound snatched by the wind. "Please," she said, "don't harm me." She took a ragged breath, and then she made a bargain with the devil in the dawn. "If you don't, I'll bear you strong children." The knife didn't move. The wind stopped. The whole world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the steel to fall. Jed Crow's eyes, gray and hard as river stones, didn't even flicker. He just looked at her, and in that long, terrifying moment, something shifted. It wasn't pity. It wasn't mercy. It was something else entirely. Something that made him look like a man trying to remember his own face in a shattered mirror. He lowered the blade, just like that. The threat was gone. The girl let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, a gasp that was part relief, part terror. It wasn't over. She knew it wasn't over. Jed looked past her, toward the edge of town. 3 horses stood tethered, their saddles empty. He knew their riders were watching from the shadows, like vultures waiting for a meal. He slowly, deliberately slid the long knife back into its sheath on his belt. It was a signal, a message sent on the wind to the hidden eyes. I chose not to. Then, without a single word, he turned his back on her and walked away, disappearing into the scrub and the long, dark memories of the land. He left her there, kneeling, bound, and completely, utterly alone in the heart of the storm. What would you do? Would you scream for help? Would you pray? She did neither. A full minute passed, the silence stretching out like a wire pulled tight enough to snap. No one came for her. The men who left her there, the men who watched from the shadows, they weren't coming back. There was no rescue, so she stood up. Her knees buckled, but she forced them straight. She looked at the rope binding her wrists, then she looked in the direction he had gone, and she made a choice that would change everything. She followed him, one painful step, then another, limping, stumbling, her body screaming in protest. But she followed the ghost into the wilderness. He had to know she was behind him. The sound of her broken steps on the gravel was the only noise in the dead-still morning. But he didn't turn back. He didn't offer a hand, didn't slow his pace. But he didn't stop her, either. They walked until the crooked buildings of Bitter Ridge were just a bad memory, swallowed by the horizon. The hills rose up around them, cracked and dry, dotted with the graves of forgotten prospectors and the burnt-out stumps of cottonwood trees. It was a land that didn't forgive. Finally, he stopped. In a small hollow, sheltered between 2 massive rocks, was a makeshift camp, a fire ring with coals that were still warm. This was his home. He knelt down and, with a piece of flint and some dry grass, he coaxed a small flame back to life. She watched him from a distance, her arms still tied in front of her. No words passed between them. It was like they were 2 ghosts from different stories, suddenly finding themselves in the same haunting. Then he did something she never expected. He stood up, took a smaller knife from his belt, and held it out to her. He offered it, handle first. A silent offer. A test. She stared at the handle, her mind racing. Was it a trick? Was this another part of some cruel game? Her fingers trembled as she reached out and took it. The steel was cold against her skin. Without hesitating, she turned the blade and sawed through the rope around her wrists. The fibers snapped, and her hands fell free. They were bleeding, but they were free. He then tossed her a clean strip of cloth. not for bandages, for cleaning the blood. It was a stark, practical gesture. There was no comfort in it, only a grim acceptance of the world they were in. When he finally looked at her, really looked at her, his eyes held something ancient. It was the look of a man who had stared into a fire that refused to die out and had seen his own reflection in the flames. Night fell fast in those hills, the shadows crawling over the rocks like black spiders. He cooked a rabbit over the fire, the smell of the meat making her stomach ache with a hunger she'd forgotten she had. He didn't ask if she wanted any. He just tore off a piece and set it on a flat rock near her. She ate. She ate like an animal, tearing at the meat with her teeth, not caring about the grease on her chin. It was the first act of living she'd felt in days. At the edge of the firelight, a lone coyote howled, its voice a thin, lonely cry against the vast, dark emptiness. She pulled her knees to her chest, the sound making her shiver. "Why didn't you kill me?" she asked, her voice small against the crackling flames. He didn't answer right away. He just stared into the fire, his face a mask of stone and shadow. "I've killed men," he said finally, his voice low and rough, like stones grinding together. "Not ghosts." Her brow furrowed. "Is that what I am to you? A ghost?" "You are already dead to them," he said, his voice flat without a trace of pity. "When they left you tied up out there for me to find. Same as me." And in that moment, she understood. The silence that fell between them wasn't empty anymore. It was thick with everything they had both lost. It was a shared blanket of loneliness. And for the first time, she wasn't just afraid of him. She was starting to understand him. Meanwhile, back in Bitter Ridge, the saloon was buzzing. Elias Dust Marrow was polishing a glass that was already clean, his eyes missing nothing. The mayor's sons, Abel and Mark Boone, were leaned up against the bar, drunk on whiskey and their own cruelty. "You think he did it?" Mark asked, his voice a low sneer. "You think that redskin finally snapped?" Dust just shrugged, his face giving away nothing. "Heard the girl didn't even scream." "Didn't have to see it," Abel, the older one, grunted. "That savage has always been a wild animal. Just needed a reason to bite." He spat a stream of tobacco juice onto the floor. "Should have just slit her throat ourselves. At least then, folks might have remembered her name." At a table in the back, their father, Mayor Silas Boone, sat alone. He sipped rye from a silver flask and said nothing. He hadn't spoken a word since his boys rode back into town without the girl. He just watched the saloon doors, his eyes cold and dead. He had given her to Jed Crow like a sacrifice, a piece of meat thrown to a wolf to distract it from the herd. But now a new fear was taking root in his black heart. What if the wolf didn't eat the meat? Outside, a man named Rory McCall leaned against the livery rail. He wasn't like the others. He'd seen the girl around town. A quiet thing, mostly invisible, but he remembered her kindness. He'd seen her leave an apple for a lame horse once, a small, secret act of grace in a town that had none. He'd also seen the Boone boys ride out with her. He'd heard their laughter, and he'd seen them ride back, their faces flushed and ugly, without her. Nobody said a thing, not to the mayor, not to the sheriff, not even to God. But Roy knew. He'd fought in the war. He knew the look of men trying to bury their shame, and he knew this wasn't over. Back in the hills, the fire burned low. Jed sat sharpening another knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. The girl was asleep near the fire, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. She twitched and whimpered, her body still trapped in the nightmare she'd just escaped. Jed's hands never stopped their work. He was a man who had learned that actions were safer than words. Words could be twisted, turned into a rope to hang you with. He'd learned that the hard way. He'd fought for the blue coats, believing their promises of safety for his people. And while he wore their uniform, he'd watched from a distance as they burned his own village to the ground. When he came back, he was a traitor to his own kind and a savage to the whites. He was just Jed Crow, a man who belonged nowhere, a ghost. The girl stirred, and her eyes fluttered open. She looked around, confused, the firelight dancing in her wide, frightened eyes. "Where are we?" she whispered. "Far enough," Jed said, his hand still moving over the blade. Not far enough, she replied, her voice trembling. They'll come for me. He nodded once, a sharp, certain movement. Let them. A long moment passed. The fire crackled, spitting an ember into the darkness. I didn't mean it, she said, so quietly he almost didn't hear her. He stopped his work and looked at her. She swallowed hard, her gaze fixed on the flames. What I said this morning, about, about bearing you children? Her voice broke on the last word. I thought it might stop you. The knife. Jed set the blade down carefully on the rock beside him. He finally truly looked her in the eyes. Words like that, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. They only stop a man when he remembers what it's like to be wanted. She stared at him, the meaning of his words sinking in. Then she looked away, her fingers digging into the dirt, the grit sliding under her nails. She didn't cry. Not yet. We don't really have names out here, do we? She said, her voice hollow. No, he agreed. But you have one, she said, looking back at him. Jed. She nodded slowly. I had one once, but they stopped saying it a long time ago. A question hung in the air between them, sharp and clear. Do you remember it? But he didn't ask, and she didn't offer. She just lay back down, pulling the thin blanket tighter around her shoulders. The wind picked up, swirling ash from the fire into the night sky like angry spirits. Back in Bitter Ridge, the lights went out one by one, but nobody was sleeping easy. And out in the hills under a sky full of cold, distant stars, a girl dreamed of being forgotten, and a man carved a notch into the handle of his knife. Not for a kill, but for a day he hadn't killed, and the story was just getting started. The next morning the world looked soft and deceptive. The rising sun painted the broken rocks in shades of gold and rose, hiding their sharp edges. Jed was already awake, standing at the edge of the camp, watching the horizon. He watched it the way a sailor watches the sea, with patience, but never with trust. Behind him, the girl woke up. She moved with a quiet hesitation, like an animal testing the air for danger before showing itself. Jed didn't turn around. Water's over the ridge, he said. Cold, but it's clean. She nodded and stood, her blistered feet aching with every step. She followed the path he had made, her silence a stark contrast to the fear that was screaming inside her. While she was gone, Jed did something strange. He took the long, menacing knife he'd held to her throat and carefully wrapped it in a piece of oilcloth. Then he tucked it deep inside his pack, as if bearing a memory. He pulled out a smaller skinning blade and began to clean it. He was a hunter, not a murderer. He only killed what was necessary, and even that took a piece of his soul every time. She returned with a heavy gourd of water, her arms trembling from the effort. He took it from her without a word, poured some into a tin cup and handed it to her. Thank you, she whispered. It was the first time she'd said those words to anyone in years. He just gave a single sharp nod. They ate dried venison and hard bread, the silence between them no longer heavy with fear, but filled with a quiet, unspoken understanding. You live out here all alone? She finally asked, breaking the quiet. He shrugged. Ain't much for company. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. No one to talk to. Folks talk too much, he said, his eyes on the horizon. And I suppose I'm just another voice, she said, tracing circles in the dust with her finger. He was quiet for a long moment. No, he said, surprising her. You're quiet. You listen first. That's rare. She looked down at her hands, at the dark rope burns on her wrists. They looked like ugly, permanent bracelets of shame. She had always bruised easily. It was just another thing people had used to call her weak. Jed stood and pulled an old heavy wool coat from a branch. It was worn and smelled of wood smoke and leather. He handed it to her. Cold air don't care if it's spring, was all he said. She put it on. It was huge on her, the sleeves falling past her fingers, but it was warm. It held a warmth that went deeper than the wool, a warmth that felt like safety. The day passed in a slow, strange rhythm. He mended his gear. She gathered firewood. They didn't speak, but they worked together, moving around each other in an unspoken dance of survival. It was less like two people trying to stay alive, and more like two broken pieces of the world slowly, carefully, learning how to fit together. That afternoon, as she sat by the fire, she spoke, her voice low and haunted. I remember when I stopped being a person. Jed kept his hands busy, but his attention was entirely on her. I was 14, she said. The preacher's wife said I looked like sin walking. All I did was ask for a second spoonful of stew at the town picnic. She shook her head, a bitter smile on her face. After that, they stopped calling me by my name. I was just that girl, or her, like I wasn't a person, just a thing that had happened to the town. Jed poked the fire with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the air. They do that, he said, his voice a low rumble. Makes it easier to hurt you when you're not a person anymore. She looked at him, her eyes sharp and intelligent. Did they do it to you? Worse, he said, his jaw tightening. They gave me names. Savage, half-breed, and then they'd spit when they said it. He stood and threw a bundle of dried sage into the fire. The smoke rose, sharp and clean, a smell of purification and memory. What did you do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stared into the rising smoke, his eyes seeing things she couldn't. At first I fought them. Then I left. Now, he said, turning his gaze back to her, I just outlast them. And for the first time she saw him, not the terrifying figure from the dawn, not the silent man in the camp, but a man carrying a weight so heavy it had turned his soul to stone. The kind of stillness that only comes after you've been battered from every side and realize there's no safe harbor left in the world. That night, something incredible happened. A coyote, brave or perhaps just lonely, wandered right up to the edge of the firelight. It sat on its haunches, its yellow eyes glowing, and just watched them. The girl didn't even flinch. Is it dangerous? She whispered. Everything out here is dangerous, Jed replied, his voice calm, and everything is sacred. The coyote tilted its head, as if it understood, and then it turned and melted back into the shadows. She woke before dawn to a cold fire and an empty camp. Jed was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. Had he abandoned her? Was this all some elaborate, cruel game? But then she saw it. Lying beside the cold coals was a rabbit, already skinned and cleaned, ready for cooking. And next to it, scratched onto a piece of tree bark, was a single word. Wait. She could have run. For the first time in her life, the choice was entirely hers. In town, every choice she made led to punishment. Out here, the freedom was more terrifying than any cage. What if he didn't come back? What if he did? The fear and the hope fought a war inside her. She stayed. When he returned at dusk, the camp was transformed. The rabbit was roasted over a newly built fire. The ground was swept clean. She had even arranged the stones around the fire pit into a perfect circle, just like he did. She didn't look up when he approached. She just held out a piece of the cooked meat. He took it and sat beside her, the setting sun casting long shadows that made them look like ancient kings and queens. They ate in a comfortable silence. You could have run, he said, his voice neutral. She shrugged, still not looking at him. You left food. You left a note. A man who plans on chasing a person down doesn't do that. He stared at her for a long, long time. You think I wouldn't? She finally turned to face him, and her eyes were clear and steady. I think you wouldn't have to. She paused, then added, You're not afraid of me anymore. He blinked, surprised by her words. He tossed the rabbit bone into the fire. She was right. The fear, that initial, primal fear of a cornered animal, was gone. In its place was something else. Something like trust. You still remember your name? He asked, the question soft in the growing darkness. She hesitated, her hand going to the pocket of the big wool coat. Yes. Then why don't you use it? She didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a small frayed circle of leather from her pocket. An old mismatched button was sewn onto it. She pressed it into her palm, her fingers closing around it like a prayer. My father used to sew, she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. He wasn't very good at it, but he mended all my clothes with this same kind of button. One day he sewed this one onto my coat pocket. He said it was a magic button, that it would protect me. Jed leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, his full attention on her. Where is he now? Gone, she whispered. The single word held a world of pain. He didn't push. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just sat with her in the darkness, sharing the weight of her grief. The days that followed fell into a rhythm not of survival, but of life. He hunted. She gathered. He carved small figures from pieces of soft wood. She wove the dry grasses into sleeping mats. They didn't talk much, but the silence was a language all its own. One evening, a storm was brewing on the horizon, the clouds bruised in purple. She handed him a bundle of cloth she had stitched together. It was rough, uneven work, but it was strong. For your saddle, she said, to keep it dry. He unfolded it and looked at her, a flicker of something close to gratitude in his slate-gray eyes. You didn't have to do that. I wanted to, she said, and it was the truest thing she had said in a long time. That night, as lightning split the sky in the distance, she dreamed of a home with no walls, only the warmth of a fire, and the quiet presence of a man who didn't ask for anything he hadn't earned. But back in Bitter Ridge, the wind was shifting. Mayor Silas Boone stood on his porch, staring out at the dark, brooding hills. She's still out there with him, he muttered to his sons. She made her choice, Mark sneered. Boone's face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. She didn't get to choose. We gave her to him. A sacrifice. And now the whole town is whispering. They're starting to ask questions. Rory McCall, mending a saddle in the nearby livery, heard every word. He tightened his grip on his tools and looked out toward the canyon. Maybe, just maybe, the whispers were getting louder. Maybe the monsters weren't the ones who lived in the hills. Maybe they were the ones who ran the town. And maybe the girl with no name was finally starting to remember who she was. That night, under a sky so clear the stars looked like diamond dust, Jed broke the silence. If you ever want to tell me your name, he said, his voice low, you don't have to wait for a reason. She looked at him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. I'll tell you, she said, when I know it's safe to be her again. He nodded once, and for now that was enough. But safety was a luxury they didn't have. The first sign of trouble wasn't a sound, it was a scar on the earth. Hoof prints. 4 riders, not trying to hide their trail, heading straight from Bitter Ridge into the high country. Jed saw them from the ridge above their camp. They weren't hunters. They were coming for someone. He came back to the camp, his face grim. The girl saw the look in his eyes and stood up, the wild onions she'd been cleaning, forgotten in her hands. They're coming, was all he said. She didn't have to ask who. Her blood ran cold. What do we do? He didn't answer. He just moved with a quiet, deadly purpose. He checked the rifle he kept hidden in his bedroll. Then he took a small shovel and buried a leather satchel deep under the roots of an old mesquite tree. A secret, a contingency. You think they'll try to take me back? She asked, her voice trembling. I think, he said, his eyes hard as flint, they'll try to make it look like you wanted to go. He paused. And if you don't, they'll make sure you can't tell anyone otherwise. The raw fear she thought she'd left behind came rushing back. Will you stop them? Jed met her gaze, and in his eyes she saw a promise colder than any threat. I'll give them the choice to stop themselves. They came at dusk, 4 dark shapes against a blood-red sky. The Boone boys, Abel and Mark, rode in front, their faces arrogant and cruel. Behind them were 2 hired guns, drifters with dead eyes and trigger-happy fingers. They didn't light a fire. Jed waited on a boulder just outside the camp, the rifle now resting across his lap. The girl hid behind the rocks, the knife he'd given her clutched tight in her hand. Evening, Crow, Abel called out, his voice dripping with false confidence. You got something that belongs to us. Jed stood slowly, a predator uncoiling. She belongs to no one. That ain't how the law sees it, savage, Mark snarled, his hand already drifting towards the pistol on his hip. You kidnapped her. She's a witness. Jed let the silence hang in the air, a weapon in itself. He was a master of stillness, of waiting. It unnerved men like the Boones, men who filled every space with noise and violence. Look, Abel said, trying a different tactic. Hand her over, and we ride away. No one gets hurt. She stays, Jed said, his voice flat and final. Abel's grin was a slash in the twilight. You sure about that? The whole town's talking, saying you got her under some kind of Apache spell. Jed took a single step forward, and the four men tensed. I'm not here to argue, he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. But if you take one more step into this camp, I'll leave just enough of you for the coyotes to whisper about for a year. Mark couldn't take it. He ripped his revolver from its holster. You really want to die for some ruined girl? He screamed, his voice cracking. Jed didn't even flinch. I've died for less. Behind the rock, the girl closed her eyes. She wasn't trembling from fear anymore. It was rage. A white-hot, cleansing rage at being called ruined, broken, a thing. We take her, Abel ordered, his patience gone. Jed raised the rifle. The click of the hammer being cocked was the loudest sound in the canyon. It was the sound of a period at the end of a sentence. I won't shoot to kill, Jed said, his voice eerily calm. Unless I have to. They'll hang you for it, Abel yelled. A dark, humorless smile touched Jed's lips. I already hang in that town every day I breathe. This'll just make it official. Abel hesitated. He'd never faced a man who didn't care about the consequences. A man with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous man in the world. And right then, they were facing two of them, because a new voice cut through the tension. No! The girl stepped out from behind the rocks. Her face was pale in the dying light, but her eyes were blazing. The knife was steady in her hand. I'm not going back with you, she said, her voice clear and strong. Mark stared at her, dumbfounded. Don't be stupid. We're here to save you. She took a step toward them, and it was they who flinched back. Save me? She said, her voice rising with every word of injustice. You left me tied up like an animal. You laughed while I bled. You called me names I won't even speak. And now you ride in here talking about saving me? No, you're here to clean up your mess, to bury your guilt. No one would believe you, Abel stammered, his bravado crumbling. Then why are you so afraid of me talking? She shot back, the point of her knife trembling with the force of her fury. Jed didn't move a muscle. He just watched, his face unreadable, as the ghost he had found in the dirt became a woman of fire and steel right before his eyes. I won't beg again, she said, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. Not for my life, and not for yours. The riders were stunned into silence. Even the hired guns looked uneasy. This wasn't the job they'd signed up for. Jed spoke again, his voice like the closing of a tomb. You come here again, you'll need more men, and they'll need better reasons. Mark spat on the ground. You think this is over? It never started, Jed said. It just came home. They turned their horses and rode away, their retreat hasty and shamed. When they were gone, the strength seemed to drain out of the girl. The knife fell from her hand, and she sank to her knees, gasping for breath. Jed walked over and knelt beside her, but he didn't touch her. They'll lie, she whispered, her head bowed. They'll go back and say I was crazed, that you threatened me. Yes, he said, and everyone will believe them. Maybe, he said. She looked up at him, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Then why did we fight them? What did we win? Jed took a breath, the cool night air filling his lungs. Because if we didn't, he said, we'd be exactly what they said we were. That night, they lit the fire high. It wasn't for warmth or for cooking, it was a beacon, a small flame of defiance against a world determined to swallow them in darkness. Jed began to carve another piece of wood. It wasn't a bird this time. It was the shape of a river, twisting and turning, meeting the unyielding shape of the land. They'll be back, she said, her voice quiet but certain. I know. Next time, they'll bring the law with them. I know. She looked into the flames, her reflection staring back at her. I don't know how to run anymore. Jed's knife paused. He looked at her, his expression serious. Then maybe we stop running. She turned to him, a spark of hope in her eyes. How? We tell our own story, he said, loud enough that folks have to listen, even if they pretend not to. And then she smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. It was the first one he had ever seen on her face. I think, she said, I think I want to remember my name again. Jed looked up from his carving, his eyes locking with hers. He waited. Not tonight, she said, but soon. He nodded. The wind swirled around them, no longer whispering of old sorrows but of new possibilities. In the distance, thunder cracked, like the world itself was breaking open. Back in Bitter Ridge, Rory McCall heard them ride back in. He heard Mayor Boone screaming, his voice full of rage and fear. No girl, no victory! It was the sound of a guilty man panicking. Dust Marrow in his empty saloon polished his glasses and stared at the wanted posters on the wall. None of them had Jed Crow's face, but he knew it didn't matter. People don't need a face to hate. They just need a name. And tomorrow the Boones would give them one. But out in the hills, under a sky that was about to break, a fire still burned. And beside it, a girl who was no longer silent sat with a man who was no longer alone. Jed finished his carving and placed it in her hand. It's a river in the land, he said. They fight, but they need each other to be whole. She turned it over in her palm. Is that what we are? No, he said, a rare warmth in his voice. It's what we could be. The morning came with a heavy, suffocating stillness. No wind, no bird song, just the silence of a world holding its breath before the breaking of a storm. Jed stood on the ridge, watching the road from town. He knew they were coming, and this time, it wouldn't be just the Boone boys. By noon, he could see the dust cloud, a dozen riders at least. They moved with the grim purpose of a posse, and in the middle of them, a black-covered wagon, the kind they use for prisoners, or for bodies. He went back down to the camp. They brought a marshal, he said. The girl's face went pale. So soon? They were always ready, Jed said grimly. They just needed an excuse, and last night, we gave them one. Her hands clenched the fabric of the old wool coat. Are you going to run? No. Fight? Only if they make me, he said. He began to gather their few belongings, his movements calm and deliberate. She watched him for a moment, then she straightened her shoulders. Then I'll stay too. He paused and looked at her. Really looked at her. The haunted, hollow look was gone from her eyes. It had been replaced by a fire he had helped to light. He took the small carving of the river and the land and pressed it into her palm. She closed her fingers around it tightly. The posse reached the base of the hills. At their head rode a thin, tired-looking man with a polished badge that glinted in the harsh sunlight. This was Marshal Ames. Behind him, in the wagon he'd brought for the girl, sat Mayor Silas Boone, his face a thundercloud of righteous fury. His sons rode on either side, their rifles held ready. Jed walked out to meet them, alone. His hands were empty, hanging loose at his sides. You Jedediah Crow? The marshal asked, his voice dry as dust. Jed nodded. Got a warrant here, Ames said, holding up a piece of paper, for the abduction of one female, unknown age, listed as property of Bitter Ridge Township under the holdings of Silas Boone. Jed's face remained a mask of stone. She's not property. I don't write the law, I just enforce it, the marshal said, his eyes scanning the camp behind Jed. She came here on her own, stayed here by her own choice. She got a name? Ames asked, his gaze sharp, and that's when she stepped out from behind the rocks. She walked to stand beside Jed, her head held high. I have a name, she said, her voice ringing out in the canyon. The marshal turned his head, his eyes widening slightly in surprise. And I'm not going back with them, she declared. Silas Boone scrambled to his feet in the wagon. Don't listen to her, Marshal. He's filled her head with savage lies. She's been corrupted. The girl turned her fiery gaze on the mayor. What would you know of corruption, Silas Boone? She called out, her voice filled with a power no one in that posse had ever heard from her. You left me for dead. You sold me with your silence. Marshal Ames frowned, looking from the furious girl to the sputtering mayor. He looked at Jed, standing calm and ready beside her. Something wasn't adding up. That true? He asked Jed. She was left bound at the edge of town? For sport, Jed said, his voice cold. I took her in. That's all. He's a liar, a savage, Boone screamed, his face turning purple with rage. Jed took a step forward, his eyes locked on the mayor. You should know, he said, his voice low and deadly. I don't care about dying, but if you try to drag her from this place, I will show every man here just how much a man can do before he falls. The silence that followed was absolute. The posse members exchanged nervous glances. Marshal Ames looked from Boone's hateful face to the girl's defiant one. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man with eyes. "What's your name, miss?" he asked, his voice softer now. She hesitated for just a heartbeat. The world seemed to lean in, waiting. She took a deep breath. She let go of the years of being that girl, of being a ghost. "Adeline," she said. Her voice didn't shake. "My name is Adeline." Jed closed his eyes for a second, a silent breath passing through him. The name was beautiful. It was a name worth fighting for. "She's lying!" Boone shrieked, beside himself with fury. "She's been bewitched by him. You can see it." But the marshal wasn't looking at Boone anymore. He was looking at Adeline. And when he'd heard her name, a flicker of recognition had crossed his face. He reached into his coat and pulled out a different piece of paper, a folded, worn letter. "I've got orders to remove her," he said slowly. "But I've also got eyes. And what I see is a woman standing here of her own free will." He looked directly at Silas Boone. "This isn't justice," he said, his voice hard. "This is shame dressed up in a badge." That's when Boone snapped. With a wild cry of rage, he leaped from the wagon, pulling a pistol from his coat. He lunged at Adeline. But Jed moved like lightning. He didn't draw his own weapon. He didn't throw a punch. He stepped inside the arc of Boone's arm, grabbed his wrist, twisted, and threw the mare to the ground. The pistol went off, the shot echoing harmlessly through the canyon. No one else moved. Jed stood over the gasping, pathetic form of Silas Boone, and then he simply stepped back. He had proven his point without spilling a drop of blood. "Enough," Marshal Ames said, his voice ringing with authority. He gestured to the stunned Boone boys. "Put him in the wagon." They hesitated, but one look at the marshal's face told them the game was over. They loaded their own father into the prison cart he had brought for Adeline. Ames rode up to Jed and Adeline. "She'll need to testify," he said. "I'll file a full report. It won't be easy for either of you." Jed nodded. "We didn't come here for easy." The marshal looked at Adeline, his expression one of respect. "You sure you want to see this through?" She stepped closer to Jed, and for just a moment, her hand found his. It was a small, brief touch, but it was everything. "I'm sure," she said. The marshal tipped his hat. "Then you're both free to go, at least until someone tells me different." He turned his horse and led the shame posse away, the wagon carrying the disgraced mayor rattling behind them. They stood there until the dust settled, leaving them alone again in the quiet hollow. But it felt different now. It felt like home. That night the sky was a riot of stars. They sat close by the fire, the silence comfortable and deep. Adeline placed the small wood carving between them. "You said this was the land and the river," she murmured. Jed nodded. She touched it gently. "Then we'll find a place where they meet." He smiled. A real smile. One that reached the lines around his eyes. It was a smile that had been earned through fire and fear. She leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and the weariness of a lifetime seemed to fall away. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" he asked, his voice a low rumble beside her ear. "For not seeing me the way they did. For seeing me when I couldn't even see myself." Jed was quiet for a moment, the firelight playing across his stoic features. "I saw you," he said, his voice steady and true, "long before you ever spoke." A coyote howled in the distance, but it wasn't a lonely sound anymore. It was a sound of the wild, of freedom, of a world that was vast and full of possibility. Sometimes in a world that tries to erase you, the most powerful thing you can do is speak your own name. Adeline had spoken hers, and Jed had heard it, and that was the beginning. Not of a legend, not of a story, but of a life. Two lost souls, two ghosts, who found each other in the wilderness and decided to stop being haunted. And together under a sky full of stars, they were finally truly alive. If you've ever felt forgotten, or like your voice doesn't matter, remember this story. Remember that sometimes you're not saved by a hero in shining armor. You're saved by the person who simply sees you for who you are and decides you're worth standing beside. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales from the edge of the map, where justice is hard won and hope is a flickering flame in the darkness, then do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell. You won't want to miss what comes crawling out of the shadows next.